why don't we get a slow start to this evening? Thank you so much for everyone who has joined us here this evening, and for those on Facebook as well. Welcome to the 2022. I had to take a moment to say the full word, not 2021 edition of the of Luke's Legacy Family Engagement in Research Rounds. For those of you who are new to the concept, this is a knowledge mobilization initiative through Kids Brain Health Network. And this was actually created in memory of my son, Luke, who passed away in 2020. He was a young man who was very much, had understood that in life, he deserved a seat at the table. And it's in his memory that we gather here today. And tonight, I am absolutely privileged to introduce both Ingrid and Jennifer, who come to us to talk about employment and an initiative that they have been working on in regards to inclusive practices. Please feel free to introduce yourself. I'm going to pass the mic on to both of you. Thank you for coming here tonight, and we're just so happy to have you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ray. We both introduce ourselves in the course of the presentation, so I will just leap in. But I will also start off by saying thank you to Kinga and to Ray for inviting us to come here this evening. It's a real pleasure, and we hope that you enjoy it, and we hope that we can have some conversation, because this does look like a smaller group that we have here this evening. So we hope that what we have to talk about sparks some conversations and some questions at the end of our presentation. So thank you very much. Okay, so my name is Jennifer Crowson, and I come to you today through ODEN, which is the Ontario Disability and Employment Network. And I'm here with my colleague Ingrid, and we're going to talk to you about employment, the gold standard for inclusion, which is some work that I've been doing on for ODEN over the last couple of months. So before we get into it, we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. One, which everybody has already done. I think we've all gotten used to this piece of housekeeping, just to keep your mic off, because it just keeps the sound down. Certainly, if you've got questions as we go through it, both Ingrid and I are really good at keeping an eye on the chat when the other person is talking. So just by all means, put that into the chat if you've got questions, but we will have time for questions at the end of our conversation. And as Kinga already indicated, this session is being recorded, just so that everybody's aware of that. And I understand we're also on Facebook Live. So hello to anybody watching. I have actually never done a Facebook Live. So this is a little tick that I can put on my box. So that's exciting. Okay. And again, before we move on, I do want to take this moment to just acknowledge the land upon which both Ingrid and I reside and work. And I invite you to think about where you are currently situated, because I know we have people here from different parts of Ontario and indeed different parts of Canada. But both Ingrid and I are in Hamilton. The city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources of the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is both covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. So I invite you to consider where you are located. So moving along, what are our objectives this evening? What do we want to cover with you in the next hour? We want you to walk away knowing a little bit about who ODEN are and why we think that employment is an important goal for everyone. We're going to have a look at what is the evidence that employment is possible for people who have developmental disabilities. And we're also going to look at how a future for a person with a developmental disability can include meaningful and paid employment, and where families can turn to for help and for support in reaching that goal for their young person. So who am I? So my name's Jennifer Crowson. I'm currently a diversity and inclusion specialist with ODEN, with the Ontario Disability Employment Network. My work experience is mostly in child welfare, and I've also done some work in public policy research and in academia. I'm a real active member of particularly within the Down syndrome community, and I'm a current board member of the Canadian Down Syndrome Society, and as well as the local Down Syndrome Association here in Hamilton. I have 3 very active young boys who keep me very busy and keep me young, and my youngest son, Owen, was born with Down syndrome. I'm going to let Ingrid introduce herself and tell us a little bit about who ODEN are.
Good evening, everybody. I think it is a first for me as well doing a Facebook Live, so thank you for that opportunity. My name is Ingrid Muschta. I am the Director of Special Projects and Innovation with the Ontario Disability Employment Network, ODEN. My work has not been in the social sector, but rather in the private sector. I am an engineer by trade that has worked in industry for about 20 years prior to coming to the not-for-profit. And I do have some experience as an entrepreneur, as well as working in the not-for-profit settings in a volunteering basis, particularly with the Down Syndrome Association of Hamilton as a volunteer with them since 2013. What brings me to the disability community is my son, Alex, who was born in 2010, pardon me, and he was born with Down syndrome. And I understood very quickly that in order for him to thrive, I had to become very involved in his life. And through opportunities that came along, I was introduced to ODEN, and they took a chance in being very diverse and including an engineer in their ranks. And I think that that has really impacted them quite a bit, because as we know, diversity brings a lot of perspectives to the business community, including the not-for-profit. So to give you just a very generic overview of the Ontario Disability Employment Network, ODEN, we are a professional network of employment service providers. These are agencies in our communities with a united message or a united mission to advance and increase employment opportunities for people who have a disability. Members in our network come from a number of backgrounds in terms of the expertise that these agencies have, as well as the diversity within the disability community that they support. Agencies can include the likes of Canadian National Institute for the Blind, the Canadian Hearing Society, your typical community livings that you find across our communities. And our membership right now, it's sitting at about 144 members across the province of Ontario, but with some of our members having a national footprint and representation across Canada. What we do, I like to say that we are involved in 5 pillars of engagement. We work with the business community to help them integrate people who have a disability in their workplaces and do so confidently. We work with the employment service sector to build their capacity so that they understand that when they're providing services not just to the job seekers that come to them, but also to the businesses that are looking for the talent. We do a little bit of work around advocacy for the sector, and I shouldn't say a little bit, we do work around advocacy for the sector when we are being asked to sit at roundtables where policy is being developed that can have an impact on employment outcomes for people who have a disability. We look for and do research on best practices in the sector and translate that knowledge onto our agencies so that they can adapt models or adopt models that are very proven, that increase employment opportunities for people who have a disability. And then we are engaged with stakeholders such as yourselves for those family networks, those post-secondary and academic networks, where the impact of employment opportunities can be seen outside of our own sector. So that's who ODEN is. When we talk of our vision, what gets me up every day and brings me to this chair, and I sit here for most of my day, is that vision that all people who have a disability in the province of Ontario and across Canada really have access to the labor force and the ability to achieve meaningful employment. And I think it's important at this point to note a couple of things. some of the things that we are going to be talking about today may not resonate with everybody, because disability is very personal. It is very unique. How the person experiences disability is a very unique experience. But we come to you from the place of employment, with a lens of employment, a lens of inclusion. And a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about is about working to ensure that people who have a disability, and in this case, developmental disabilities, have meaningful access to employment. So I want us to take a very short little activity to see if you want to play along with us. Think and write, if you're capable to do so, in the chat. Why do you work? What gets you going at the beginning of your day? What drives your passion for work? Thank you, Laura, to make an impact. To make the world a better place for families and kids. Hanging out with awesome people. Mr. Roger told kids to look for the helpers. So you're looking for the helpers. That's awesome. Helping people, especially kids. You know, there is research out there that tells us that a paycheck is really like at the bottom of the top 10 reasons why people work. People go to work because they want to make a contribution, because they want to have purpose, because they find satisfaction in being among other people. So do people who have a disability. And when we do not work to create those foundations for them to have access to meaningful employment, we're denying them the same opportunities, the same reasons for employment that you and I had just put up on the chat box. So this concept of meaningful employment and access to employment is really, really important. And now we'll talk about employment first as a philosophy, as a way of thinking when we are considering what happens to my child after they have left the educational system, whether it's high school or a post-secondary education. Employment first is a policy that was created in the United States that says that employment in the general workforce, not in segregated shelter workshops, is the first and preferred outcome in the provision of publicly funded services for all working age citizens with disabilities, regardless of the level of disability. What that means is that when you access a service provider and you are looking to enter the workforce, that service provider would do everything in their power to ensure that you have access to employment when you are ready and when you want to be entering the workforce. It is the preferred option for anyone who has a disability. And employment first also tells us that we should see people and presume that they are competent. Start with competency. Presume that they are employable until proven otherwise. And what's really interesting is that that quote comes from the business sector. They are the ones that told us that they presume that everybody can do the job until they're proven that they can't. That you are accessing real jobs with real wages. You do not volunteer at a Pizza Hut where somebody else is getting paid for the same thing that you're doing. You are being provided access to wages and real jobs. And you work in jobs that are fully integrated within the general workforce, because that's how we learn. That's how we truly go for inclusion in the workplace. And just to set the tone or context as well, I am speaking from a perspective to really, for a very long time, people who have developmental disabilities were being congregated to help them learn skills prior to entering the workforce. And in those congregations, they often were left behind in a continuous revolving door of skilling up and skilling up. So what we're saying is that under the employment first policy, you learn the work in the workforce. You learn how to do things in your job, not in a segregated setting. And you need to be reevaluating on a regular basis when you are being told that you're not ready to go to work. So that means that if you're accessing publicly funded services through an employment service provider, and they're saying that you're not ready for work, you need to be provided with a plan that is evaluated often as to what are the skills that you need to get in order to go for that job that you want. And then the last thing I want to say is that we need to be normalizing this concept of accommodation, of modifications in the workplace. Children receive an IEP and children receive modifications through their educational system. But once they leave the educational system, that concept of being accommodated is removed. So we need, as a society, to be normalizing this idea that accommodations, modifications in the workplace are just a natural progression of what that child had to, the right that that child had from the educational system moving on to the workforce. And think about it, we all have accommodations. I am coming to you wearing my glasses, my fancy glasses that allow me, they have bifocals and allow me to see from far and close. If you could see my board, you will see my color-coded sticky notes that allow me to organize my day, because that is what I need. That is my modification. I have lights that allow me to navigate my environment. So we need to normalize this idea that everyone has access to accommodations or modifications in the workplace. And again, why is employment first such an important policy? When employment is seen as the first and the most logical progression for a person after leaving the educational system, the supports are allocated to make it happen. And the outcomes are quite impressive. And I want to give you that an example or a comparison. In the state of Washington, they had a long-standing commitment to these policies and this practice, and they focused on employment in the community as a first priority. And so what they ended up doing is that all stakeholders, families, educational system, the local community, the local communities and the local business communities began to think about employment as a priority. And as a result, 87% of individuals served by the Washington state were fully integrated into employment services, compared to a national average of 20%. Now, if you compare that to Canada, in Canada, only 26% of working age people with an intellectual disability are employed, compared to, and 63% are not even in the workforce, have never had attachment to the labor force, have never had a job, and with 10 or 11% of them being currently unemployed. What is the difference? Again, it was organized, policy-driven, prioritized, that for Washington state, employment first was what they wanted. So it's a lot about changing our expectations. What do we, when we think of our young people who have a disability or a developmental disability, are we thinking about university? Are we thinking about apprenticeship, college, the workplace, or does our mind automatically go into what is a typical community participation setting, segregated with other people who have a disability? And I know you probably can see this quite well and that you can read it as well, but I'm going to read it to you. This is a paragraph from an article by Carol Glaser. She is the CEO of a national organization on disability in the United States. And she speaks about the tyranny of low expectations, about those who set the early expectations for children who have a disability. Parents, school administrators, employers, caregivers usually have the best intentions in mind. But nevertheless, many unwillingly engage in the tyranny of low expectations, seeing deficits and not strengths, seeing disability and not ability. And people who have a disability pick up on those messages, because it's really, really hard to expect much of yourself when others don't expect much of you. It's hard to believe in yourself when others don't. So our conversation is really about changing expectations. And the other thing to keep in mind is that opportunities to enter the workforce for people who have a disability are in the rise. They are increasing. People who have a disability are more visible, more included in our society now. There is an increased awareness within the community, the business community, that they want to do not what is right, but they want to do what is good for their profit, because they know that the disability community is a loyal consumer base. They want to hire more inclusively. And people who have a disability are more interested in working. They are seeing their siblings going to work. They are seeing their siblings going to university or post-secondary. They want that thing too. They want to work. So I leave now Jennifer to present the evidence of why employment is possible.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you so much for that kind of the passion that you bring to this conversation. I always really appreciate it. So with everything in mind that Ingrid's been talking about, and with other knowledge that ODEN had, in particular, this idea that I'm going to move on to the next slide, I think, Ingrid, so we know that early engagement in work, so things like co-ops and summer jobs, are really foundational to future success in employment. We also know, that the #1 indicator for successful labor market attachment for people who have a disability upon graduating high school was that they had a paid job while they were in school. But what we were also observing was that there was a notable lack of employment programs and supports that met those unique needs and abilities of youth who have a developmental disability. So with that in mind, ODEN undertook some research in early 2021, and we did this with the support of the Ministry of Children and Community and Social Services here in Hamilton. And we did some research, here in Hamilton, here in Ontario. We did this research at the beginning of 2021, the first couple of months of 2021. And in that research, what we did is we looked at and we explored the literature. We looked at the literature. We also explored various strategies that enhance access to, success in, and employment for youth who face barriers to employment. And what we did, our methodology was that we did a comprehensive literature review. We did a series of in-depth interviews with employment service providers who have had success in supporting young people with and without developmental disabilities to achieve meaningful employment. And those interviews took place with organizations and stakeholders who were located in Ontario, Manitoba, Quebec, and Ireland. And in that, we collected details such as a general description of what their program was, who were the job seekers that they served, how were they staffed, who were their partners, and what were some of the outcomes and deliverables of that program. And here's what we learned. One of the things that was really striking, and came out in both the literature and in the interviews we had, and is fitting along with what Ingrid was speaking about earlier in the conversation, it was that youth who have a developmental disability and those who are leaving the educational system were not leaving with the same foundations as those without a disability. And that was really striking. Why was that? We learned that, sometimes that the attitudes that parents may have, and I'm not talking about a bad attitude, I'm just talking about how a parent views their child who may have a disability, and the caregivers and the professionals, that those matter, that having those high expectations for our young people matter. And without those expectations that employment might be possible, it is potentially limiting for those youth. The other thing we heard is that youth, particularly with developmental disabilities, were lacking those necessary soft skills, such as communication skills, personal living skills that employers were looking for. They were looking for their employees to come with those skills. They were not looking to have to teach those skills at the point of employment. The other thing is that youth who were provided with opportunities for supported co-op and internship opportunities during high school were more likely to experience success. But again, we were hearing that the experiences those youth with developmental disabilities and indeed disabilities within high school, it didn't look the same. And so they weren't leaving with that same skill set that their peers were leaving with. The other, I'm going to move on to the next slide, I think, Ingrid. Yeah. The other thing that we found and we heard was that having strong partnerships made a tremendous difference, impact employment pathways. And when I say partnerships, I'm talking about between the education departments and with service providers in their community, with businesses in their community, and that made a difference. When those partnerships existed and when they were strong, it had an impact on providing opportunities for young people in their community. It also allowed for shared space. We heard about some programs here in Ontario where schools were making use of business space and spaces or centers within their community in order to offer some of that training and support for the young people prior to them going into employment opportunities. The other thing we heard is that literacy and numeracy was very, very important. And that these remain very important for employment success. Yet we were also hearing that some of our young people with developmental disabilities in particular were not leaving the academic and the education system with those foundational literacy and numeracy skills that were required. And I say that, you know, with some understanding that literacy looks different for everybody. And it harps back to the point that Ingrid made earlier, that we do appreciate that disability looks different for everybody, but we also really wondered in this as whether or not we need to rethink how we're thinking about literacy for our young people who have developmental disabilities within the education system. So what does all of this mean? And again, I recognize this was a quick piece of research. I do recognize that. But what does this mean? And what were some of the things that we were hearing from service providers, and what were we seeing in the literature that might help us to think about this early and start preparing for employment early? But before I move into that, I want to sort of pause and be personal here with you for a moment. And I want you to know, some of you know, when I said in my introduction, you know, that I have a son who has Down syndrome. And when I was pregnant was when I found out that he was going to be born with Down syndrome. And even at that stage in parenting this young man, I was told to lower my expectations of what his future might look like. You know, and I was given a list of many things that he might not do. You know, that he might not walk, he might not talk, he might not go to regular school, he might not have friends, he'll probably never live alone or independently, and he certainly will probably not have a job. These were the things I was told as a parent, you know, pregnant, expecting this child. You know, imagine if all expectant or new parents were told that. You know, it's hard to not let comments like that define and guide your approach to parenting. And I completely get that. You know, you also are told that your child's health might be fragile, and indeed your child's health might be fragile. So your instincts are to protect, and they are to keep that child safe from harm. That's what our instincts are as parents, and to minimize the risk experiences that your child may have. It also have, you know, the kind of flip side of that is it then has an impact on what our children might experience as they're growing up in terms of the, you know, potential risk situations that I may allow my son to get into, where he may learn things. So I chose to ignore what I heard, obviously, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about what I'm talking to you about today. You know, he's 9 years old now. He goes to a local inclusive school. He walks, he talks, he has friends. He loves his brothers. He loves to swim. He loves horseback riding. He loves his iPad, like a lot of 9-year-olds. You know, and he tells me he wants to work in a fire station when he gets older. And, you know, that sounds like a pretty typical 9-year-old to me. But that narrative that surrounds the lives of people who have a developmental disability is predominantly negative and limiting. And we really believe that needs to change. So, you know, we had a look at those dominant perceptions of vulnerability and deficits, and how is that informing how we as parents may parent, but also how is that informing the way people who are providing the education and providing the support services, you know, to our young people, and indeed those who are providing the support as a person may move into employment. And it's important to think about that dominant narrative. Because decision-making can sometimes then become focused on reducing risk. And this results in choices that may be non-vocational for a young person. The other thing we heard about in our research is that one of the deterrents, or not deterrents, but one of the barriers to things like co-op and things like summer jobs was transportation, that a young person may not know how to take transportation. But equally, we heard, you know, that some parents didn't want their children to be taking, you know, public transportation. We also heard that in some communities, transportation itself doesn't exist. But that came up a lot. That actually came up a lot. But those worries that a parent may have about, can my young person take that bus independently? Is that even going to be possible for them? The other thing we heard is that they are worried, that the parents were worried about whether or not their child will complete the job well. And are they going to do what's being asked of them? You know, I think of myself as a parent of 3 children. I do that with my 3 children. You know, I worry about, are they doing their homework the way it's expected of them? Are they doing things the way it's expected of them? And it's us needing to take a step back and allow them to learn equally from their mistakes and from their experiences as we do our other children who may not live with a disability. So it's just challenging that thinking a little bit. We're going to share with you a short video from Inclusion Australia, and I hope the volume works, and maybe if somebody can give us an indication if it doesn't work. But this is a good segue into the next part of our presentation. Can everybody hear? Okay.
Expectations of people with disabilities can be sometimes very low. If you don't do things to encourage people to be independent, then they become dependent on people. When I was in Scouts, it really showed me that you can do a lot of things. I remember sleeping on concrete floors in sleeping bags, and that's what able-bodied people do too. So I was included in that society. And what I do now for work, I can go back in my life and go, well, Scouts was a big part of that.
As far as jobs around the house goes, I try. The main things I'm really consistent with at the moment is just getting him to dress himself and to choose his clothes and to be independent when he needs. Not always jumping in to do things for him, so giving him the opportunity to do them himself first and know that he can do them and that that is the expectation. It's really important that he learns to do things himself so that he doesn't rely on other people. That means he's got a greater level of independence. It means he's got more options as far as living independently, having a job in the future, having that idea that he doesn't have to wait for someone to come in and do things for him. He can make his own choices and he can make his own decisions, and he's got the confidence that he's got the skills to do that as well.
My advice to parents out there is let them have the freedom to experiment. Let them make mistakes. I think because if you don't make mistakes, you're never going to learn.
Firstly, presume competence. You know, you have to believe that your child is capable. And if they're not capable now, that they will be, or they might be. Follow their passions and follow their interests, and surround yourself with people who can help you achieve that. I also think talking about what you do in your life, what you do for jobs, what other people do for jobs, what is possible. Some people might say that I'm setting him up to fail, but I'm just opening lots and lots of doors for him, and he will decide which ones he steps through.
Love that video. I love listening to the accents. Really helpful messages in there, and I hope you found that as well. So when we looked at our research and other research and our findings, we really chose to take a person-centered approach, and we see that child who may have a developmental disability or a disability at the center of that, with those different systems around them, but they all interconnect, and the role that each system plays in the child's life and development is important and integral. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about things that we can all do to support a child who has a developmental disability to reach their full potential, and to support the development of skills and interests and foundations that are needed for successful entry into employment, into the world of work, things that we were hearing from our research. Our research told us what some of the barriers were and what was often missing for youth with developmental disability. And we really believe that families, parents, siblings, teachers, EAs, healthcare providers, social care providers, service providers, that we all have a role to play and that we can make a difference. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. And although I talk about things being at home and being at school, they're not just exclusive. It's not to say these things can't happen in different aspects of a person's life. And I had a quick look through some of the chat while that video was playing, and I think there's a lot of people who share a lot of the same views and passion. I have to say that both Ingrid and I do. So one thing I do want to mention is we've done this workshop several times now, Ingrid and I, and we've been doing this workshop to service providers and to educators. And so I think there has been some great moments with some of those groups. And I hope that you're finding some new information in what we're saying here, or in fact, it's just reinforcing what you're already doing as parents or caregivers or service providers. So starting early, that's a key message there, starting with those high expectations, starting with those expectations that, our young people will do what they are capable of and able to do within the home. And that could include having some chores and responsibilities. The other thing is thinking about exploring what are their interests and providing them with opportunities to find passion, to doing. And whilst doing all of that, giving them some functional life skills in terms of that personal hygiene, in terms of dressing, in terms of eating, and in terms of communicating. So those kinds of soft skills, if you like, that we know employers are looking for later on in life. It may be a little hard to see, but I believe people are going to receive copies of the slides from the presentation, but there's some examples there of some, age appropriate chores that you may want to encourage your young people to do that are going to encourage and support their growth. So the other thing is play. So encourage play that allows your child to see themselves as a worker. Right? So things like being a teacher, things like being a doctor, a firefighter, an office worker. I remember I think I've told this story in previous, I used to play office all the time in my basement when I was a child. And what's really interesting is I'm now sitting in my basement in an office, so I was maybe predicting the future then, but it was one of my favorite games to play when I was a child. Encourage that in all of our children, allowing them to see themselves as a contributor. The other thing is talking about jobs, and the mom in that video talked about that. Like, talk to them when you're out and when they see other people working. I mentioned earlier that my son Owen wants to be a firefighter. We drive by the fire station every day on the way to school, and every morning he points out that fire station, and every morning I talk to him about different things that fire people do when they're at work. And sometimes the truck is out and the lights are going on. He's always curious about what are they doing? What are they doing? Why are the lights on? And so we talk about that. Well, they're checking the truck. They're making sure that the truck is going to be okay if they have to go out to a fire. And that's a really important thing that a fire person has to do. The other thing is asking your child, what do they want to be? What do they want to be when they grow up? How often were you asked that question when you were a child? How often are you asked that question now? But how often were you asked that question when you were a child? And we need to make sure that we're also asking that of our young people with disabilities. The other thing is teaching resilience and giving them opportunities to experience and overcome failure. And that's the one that I know is hard. And it goes back to that slide where I was talking earlier about how we really have and I get that as a parent, you know, we have a desire to protect, but there also is this, you know, this what young people can learn from being given the opportunity to overcome failures and to have challenges. The other thing is encouraging fitness and personal hygiene, as I said earlier, but in just encouraging some self-care for your young person. And that we know is important for employment as well, in terms of being somebody who is recognizing self-care as something as important. So what can we do at school? Academics are important, you know, and allowing access in inclusive environments as much as is possible. We know that inclusion within education is important for young people who have disabilities, and allowing them access to those variety of educational experiences we believe is terribly important. So here on the right, you're going to see young Alex, this is Ingrid's son, showing off his science project. Of course he should participate in the science fair. You know, and this is my son on the left there, who's doing his best to write and to print. So making sure that they are given those opportunities to experience the same academic challenges that their peers are, and that we are recognizing if they require accommodations and additional supports in order to access the same things as their peers, that they are provided with those things in an education setting. Literacy should be an educational goal. As I said earlier, that's going to look different for every child. And literacy doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to pick up this piece of paper in front of them and be able to understand everything on there. But do we need to create something that they are able to take meaning from? Because that becomes important in a job situation, that there is some literacy there. But what does that look like, and how are we thinking about how we allow access to literacy for our young people is really important. You know, we believed in advocating for full inclusion, and that we work as a team really early on for all of our young people. We think it's also important to participate in extracurricular alongside children who don't have a disability. We sometimes hear, and I've had this experience myself, and I've heard about it from friends, that let's say there's a track and field event. Well, I'm sorry, you know, Billy can't come unless you're able to come with him. No, you know, our young people deserve to be at that track and field event just as much as the other children in the school. It's the school community and who needs to think about how we're going to accommodate and make sure that our young people participate in all of those extracurricular activities. These activities provide an opportunity to discover what our kids are good at and what they're interested in. You know, are they interested in being runners? I can tell you my son probably is not interested in being a cross-country runner, but that's okay. He enjoys being there with his peers. The other thing that's going on here, and we all know this about inclusion, is that their peers who are not living with a disability are seeing the inclusion of their peers who do have a disability. And we obviously when they get older. So that's important. Keeping records matters. So being able to talk about what your child is good at. What don't they like? What do they really enjoy? And then how can we help them make those connections between things that they're interested in and what they might do with those interests in the future? So again, here, just to use Alex as an example, he loved the water, and I can tell you that boy loves to swim. I have seen him swim, and he's a strong swimmer. So why wouldn't we think about him being a lifeguard at some point in his future, and think about that as a potential opportunity for him? And on the right there, we have we're seeing there a news story about a young man who happens to have Down syndrome, who is taking his lifeguard certificate. Fantastic. So keep records. Think about what they like and dislike. Is volunteering and volunteer hours. That was another thing that I heard in my research. So we also know that kids in high school in Ontario, I don't know what it is in other places in Canada, but you're required to have so many hours of volunteer work in order to get your diploma, your high school diploma. But we don't hold those same expectations for our young people with disabilities, partly because sometimes people with developmental disabilities are not on a track to get a diploma, which is a whole other conversation. I think they obviously should be, if that wasn't already obvious, but they should absolutely be supported to get their volunteer hours, because volunteer helps with skills that employers want. You know, those things like having responsibility, having a sense of community values, and developing interests and skills in communication, and much more. We know that volunteering is important. And I'm not talking about, you know, volunteering in the sense that replaces the opportunity for paid work. I think most of us here probably at some point in our lives did some volunteer work prior to perhaps applying to university or to college, or even within high school, that we've done some volunteer work. I'm talking about that kind of volunteer work. And that's also important for young people who have a developmental disability. So education, you know, we know that IEPs, which is the individual education plan here in Ontario, again, I'm not sure if the name is the same elsewhere throughout Canada, but that's that roadmap, you know, that provides support to a young person within a school setting, you know, but it also is that roadmap towards what is the life goal for a young person. And, you know, we believe that that should include employment as one of those life goals. So thinking about what it is that you need in order to be a good employee, and how might we begin integrating those into the young person's school experience. So thinking about things like being dependable, being reliable, and being motivated. How are we encouraging the development of those skills for young people within school? So here we have a link, and some of you I'm sure will be familiar with it, to the IEP guide here in Ontario. And then the other thing that we've linked there is the transition planning. And that begins for our young people in Ontario at the age of 14. Am I correct, Ingrid? At the age of 14. And that becomes really important when we think about transitioning a young person into service provider and supports that may support employment programs in order to encourage employment as a goal for that young person. So these become important guides, if you like, for us to consider. And I think we're coming, I don't know where we're at time-wise, but I know we're coming near the end, and I hope we're going to have time for questions. We want to just play you this quick clip, rather. Sorry, that was a bit of a tongue twister. This is an interview with Chris Nitschik's father, who's an Ironman athlete. And this young man is the first person with Down syndrome to complete an Ironman. And now I think he's gone on to complete many, many more, which is quite incredible. I can't even run 5K, and this young man is an Ironman. But it's the message that his dad has, which I think I think, and I hope it resonates for all of us here who have a loved one in our lives, or who have an interest in the lives of people with disabilities, because it's just that reminder about just a little bit every day. So let's play that clip. And again, if you can't hear it, let us know.
Athletic growing up, or, you know, and I guess this determined, because this is what this is really about, this race. It's not just being athletic, it's being having such strong will.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because he's always been involved in sports because he loves sports, but never we never saw any real athletic ability. In fact, when he first started the triathlon a little over 2 years ago, the first race for Special Olympics, there were 4 athletes, and Chris finished last. So he was the least likely to actually achieve this. He didn't have any athletic ability. He didn't have any determination. What happened over the last 2 years, and this is the good news for everybody, is he was able to develop both through perseverance and hard work and consistent improvement over time. He was able to develop mental toughness. He was able to develop physical toughness. And he was able to develop, you know, muscles and physical abilities that we never thought were possible. And then even more valuable at this point, what we're seeing through all these interviews as he's talking to people, his cognitive ability is starting to develop in a way we never thought possible. And so now he's just having conversations and interviews with people, something he's never been able to do before. But over the last 3 months, we've seen amazing progress. And our objective for the next couple of years is to really test the limits on the cognitive side to see how the physical and the cognitive come together. Right? Because honestly, our kids with Down syndrome, they're all the perceptions are they can't do anything physically and they can't do anything intellectually. And I think Chris is going to, change a lot of those perceptions. But they're all being changed through hard work, through effort, through perseverance. And that came a little bit at a time, 1% at a time. I know people look at the end story, but really what they should look at is the progression of it. And we'd love to share more of that to show them that, look, he made very little progress in the first year, but he built a foundation. And the more he stuck with it, the more progress he made. But it didn't happen overnight. It came very slowly.
It's a strong message, just to stick with it and to know that it doesn't happen overnight. I really appreciated that message that Chris Nichik's father had for us there. So that feels like a lot of information we've kind of thrown out there. And there's been some really interesting comments and insights in the chat, which I've tried to keep up with during the little breaks in speaking there. But we really do welcome comments or questions or, insights that you may have that we haven't thought of yet and perhaps should think of. But I really appreciate your time this evening and look forward to thoughts and comments.
Thank you so much, Ingrid and Jennifer, for sharing. This was such a wonderfully validating experience to listen to with a lot of this. Now, to start off this part of the conversation, I was wondering, Ingrid, if you could maybe come off screen sharing. That way we can see everybody on camera.
There you
now
are.
We have one initial question from Anthony to start off with here.
Thank you, Ingrid and Jennifer. I know them personally as well. As a member of the disability community, I truly believe that in life there are no problems, only solutions waiting to be found. And ODEN and HDEN are part of the solution. Collective prosperity is the be-all, end-all of what I do in my organization Above and Beyond. And it's truly about working together, creating partnerships and collaborations to create that end goal of equity. In the concept of employment in HR, there's this concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Often access is typically hidden under the equity pillar. So my goal is to extrapolate the access pillar from equity and transpose the letters, and you have IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And together we can make that change together. And I'm muting my mic.
Thank you so much.
Thank
and that
you.
is so much the thing. And it's truly a moment of nothing without us, with nothing about us without us. I lost my ability to talk there for a moment. My apologies. I'm going to go through a bit through the chat here. There was a few interesting questions. One of them from Natalie. Natalie, I'm not sure if you wanted to come off mic or I can just mention it as well too.
It's okay to read it. I asked that because I'm involved as a parent partner in a study, and we're getting a lot of criticism around not accounting for that piece, and we're not sure how to how to set it up so that we don't get that criticism.
So just for a reference for the question, it's how did you account for whether the disability didn't impact performance?
That's a really interesting question. So I think the best answer I can give, Natalie, and I'm not sure if it's going to be terribly helpful for your question around the methodology, is first of all, this was quite a short research project. For those of you who are used to longer, more, much longer research projects, this was not one of them. So that being said, we also looked at programs that supported youth who face barriers. We didn't just seek out those that supported youth who have a disability, if that makes any sense. But in doing so, one of the questions we had for the service providers and for the programs was, are you kind of collecting information on those youth who come to you with who identify as having a disability? And is there anything within that is unique, you know, in terms of a barrier, right? Because a lot of these barriers were quite intersectional, if that makes sense, you know, in that, you know, a youth may have a disability, but they also may have other, you know, identifications about themselves that are minority. So it was difficult to tease it out. And I don't know if Natalie, if that's what you're experiencing in terms of the research that you're doing, or
exactly what the problem is like they're saying, how do you know it's this and not this, or not this and this? And you can't account for everything, but we don't want everything to come down to, well, it's because she's got Downs. Clearly,
yeah, and it's not. I mean, I think the other thing, what was also very clear to me anyway, is that, you know, what I was repeatedly hearing is that, okay, so here's what employers are looking for, right? And when I talked about that kind of like soft skills, you know, coming, you know, with some of those skills that they don't want to teach, is that when we peeled back the onion and we had a look at, well, what are those people, when I looked at the literature, what are those people who come with a developmental disability? They were not coming with the same grounding as other youth, if that makes sense. Like the literature did support that, maybe not necessarily our research that we did to unpick that level of detail, Natalie, but certainly some of the literature that I looked at did.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
There was some really good stuff from Inclusion Australia, by the way. And I believe all of our resources are at the end of this presentation. So you might want to have a look at some of the research that I looked at for this research.
I definitely do. And I was going to ask about that. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I don't know, Ingrid, if you want to add to that, but that.
Yeah, the other comment I was going to make, you know, is that employers know that they have to teach the technical stuff. And good employers will do a good job at ensuring that their training is accessible. And I'll give you maybe a very short example. In Milton, we have worked with a manufacturing facility that has hired 6 people who are deaf, and a couple of those people also have a developmental disability. And so for that employer, training became an extended training period. So instead of training everybody within one day, which is what they were doing, they understood that people who are deaf have to use their eyes quite a bit, of course, because that's how they're communicating through ASL. So that would cause a lot of fatigue. And so they extended that training to a week, where they were doing training in the classroom during the morning and training hands-on on the floor during the afternoon. So that's an employer, that is a business that understands that accessing this talent required them to do some modifications on how the training was done. So I think it's important to recognize that performance for people who have been trained properly in the literature indicates that they're perform equally or just as or better than people who do not have a disability. It's particularly, you know, when we're looking at work that requires us to do things in the same manner, if we're talking about some jobs. So that's just the one note that I want to add, that when you have a business that's truly looking at how do they reflect the community that they are within, because businesses understand that 1/4 of our population self-identifies as having a disability. They understand that half of our population is impacted by disability. And so they will want to reflect the community in which they're doing businesses, because those are the employees that are coming to them. So those businesses understand that hiring your son or daughter makes a good business sense because you're maybe an employee. And, you know, understanding disability also for them is important, because they may end up having employees who come to disability later on in life. So it's from a business proposition, that lens, that there's a lens in there of that diversity, as Anthony was indicating. The businesses are really understanding that they need to do better, not from a social corporate responsibility. They've moved on beyond that to what is good for our business. is engaging our community, is really truly engaging those who are in the margins, and to bring them in, because now our community, our economical engine is best when everybody in that community is employed.
Thank you so much for that. Well, we have time for one more question before we'll call it an evening. Melanie, you got your hand up.
I do have my hand up. This is kind of an observation / question. I am a parent of a 9-year-old with a disability, and I also have started a very small social enterprise, which at this point has run for one farmer's market. So it's a tiny social enterprise, but the purpose of the social enterprise is to create a business that's solely created in order to hire people with disabilities, to have them have paid employment alongside typical staff and volunteers, so they're in an integrated work environment, and get the skills that they can't get from the program, so that they're more ready to be hired by the employees on the other side. So it's a pass-through program. And the thing that fascinated me the most in the course of running this program last summer, we had 3 employees that came to us with developmental disabilities, was one day we decided we were going to jump in the deep end and they were going to handle money, which was something that all of them at the beginning said they would never be able to do. And I like a challenge, so off we went. And I brought the cash box. And they said, "You mean we're going to use real money to learn about money?" And the idea that they had all come through high school programs, service programs, co-op programs, some of them college programs, and they had never made change with actual cash money was fascinating to me. Like it was one of those moments where you think that's the hill that we're climbing. How do we, as parents, prepare our kids for things that you would just think had happened in any one of the number of programs they'd already been a part of? And as a parent, in hearing this, I'm thinking, wow, how are all the ways that I am not giving my kid the opportunity to do real life things because no one else is stepping up to do that? And by the end of the summer, all of them were making change, which was something everyone said they wouldn't. Now, I mean, the machine tells you it's $12.50, but they could get the $12.50. It was perfectly doable. And everyone had told us we had to be a cash-free business. And I was like, yeah, but how are they going to learn to do cash if we don't have cash? What if they get a job that has cash?
Wow.
And they were all able to do it. So the there's so many mountains we don't see. And I don't know if anybody has any advice, this is the question part, on like, how do you anticipate or how do you accommodate, I guess, for the ways in which the rest of the world is just glossing over things that would make perfect sense to most humans?
That is the $1 million. Well, first of all, Melanie, thank you. I mean, I appreciate your point and your point around everybody didn't think they could do it, and you just took it one day at a time and you got them to the point where they could do it. So thank you for that point. I mean, that's such a great question, and I think that's I think we need to blow it out of the water. I think we need to rethink how we educate young people who have developmental disabilities. I think we need to rethink how we organize public services for people who have, I mean, so my answer is probably way too big and way too ambitious, but it's what I believe needs to happen. And I know it's what Ingrid believes needs to happen. And I think a lot of us here believe it needs to happen. Right? Because we need to change that narrative that tells us, that told me when I was pregnant, your child will not do A, B, and C. It's like, don't tell me that right now. Why are you talking to me like that? So what messaging are health caregivers giving people? It peels right back to that very stage. So that doesn't really answer your question, Melanie, but I think it speaks to, I share your passion for trying to challenge this.
Yeah, I think knowing it's a shared experience is, even at the very beginning, such a great reminder that it's okay to push and push and push and push and push.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you came, Melanie. That was just such a wonderful observation and very insightful in that respect. I feel like I've got a bit of an addition to add to that as well too. And part of, I think, what the big challenge ahead is that we need policies that create a lifespan approach the fact that disability doesn't always start in adulthood, and we need to consciously figure out how to create policies that walk people and families through the process of just living life from childhood to adulthood, and make those paths less patchy and wondering who's responsible for what and this, that, and the other thing. And when that is developed, I think there's going to be more thoughtful approaches that come along the way as well too, and amazing people like you, raising the expectation level, because I think the more we do that as well too, the more that's going to be role modeled for others in many respects.
Yeah.
I'm very mindful of time, but I always say that we shouldn't judge people in a moment in time. We shouldn't judge babies when they're born. We shouldn't judge a grade 1 kid who has, or a kindergarten who has just entered the school system, that they won't be able to learn. We shouldn't judge a grade 9er as they're going through entering high school, that they won't be able to participate in the extracurriculars and graduate.
Absolutely. I recall as a parent getting a lot of flack early on for just letting my son do things. Like go to the playground and he is this tiny little human on a 7.5 foot tall slide, and just he's playing. What else? But people had that protective bubble. I had less of that protective bubble. He needed to see what that felt like any other child would, learning to and developing and things like that. And there's just so much to be said about just being bold in how we help create the stories for our kids. And I think that's such a wonderful summary of what we've been talking about here this evening. We unfortunately have need to kind of close the evening a little bit here. My apologies, folks. I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here this evening. It has been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm so thankful that you came here today. Oh yes, Melanie, I often say how Alma will show us how far she can go. It's our jobs to take the barriers out of the way. That is such a fantastic thing. Now, Jennifer and Ingrid both put their emails in the chat there as well too. I'm going to also put mine as well, and I can refer any questions. So if you catch anybody's email and you have further questions, please, by all means, feel free to connect. Now we will be having next month another one with Mayada El Sabah, who is, or Dr. Mayada, who is be talking about the subject of resilience and some analysis that's come about that and how that impacts policy as well too. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation next month, and we're looking forward to sharing that with you. So please stay tuned on Twitter or on the Can Child Facebook page. Places like that, we will be sharing that information fairly soon as well too.